And it's a terrific pivot into our final discussion of the day, where we're going to be thinking about sort of VA as the home for sort of digital innovation, or rather driving digital innovation here in the US. If we think about the investment that needs to be made into best practices, if we think about the investment that needs to be made into sort of systems and platforms, and Kimberly, your remarks around, we need to make sure that we're developing sort of shared platforms that provide sort of a single home for all of this innovation, instead of sort of multiple models that are competing with one another. VA is such a wonderful place to do that through strong and robust partnership with industry. So with that, Mohana, let me hand it over to you. For folks who don't know Mohana Ravindranath, she is a tremendous and thoughtful sort of digital health reporter at Business Insider. Mohana, you have been asking sort of hard questions about these topics for a number of years, so I'm delighted to hand the reins to you for our final session to really talk about what does it mean to make VA the home for digital health innovation.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. My name is Mohana. I'm a senior healthcare reporter at Business Insider. Really looking forward to leading this discussion, which I know is sort of the culmination of a day of other panels. We're really hoping that you can leave this session with a set of concrete takeaways sort of about how to spur digital health innovation, both inside and outside the VA. So I guess I wanted to start with kind of a stage setting question here, and get our panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Ryan. Maybe you can just talk about sort of your background very briefly, and then tell us, especially for those of us who are involved in digital health, but not specifically at the VA, what are the stakes here? Why should we be tracking what's going on sort of at the VA? Ryan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, Mohana, so my background, I'm a physician, I'm a hospitalist, take care of patients when they're admitted to the hospital, and really cut my teeth in quality and safety. So didn't sort of find my way into innovation until later, and somewhat serendipitously. And actually, to be honest, I think as somewhat of an evolution of my quality journey, in realizing and recognizing how to approach the idea of getting improvement solutions or tools into the hands of providers to help them be more effective or efficient, or working with systems to understand how to tackle problems, I began to sort of see the idea that technology can play a role, but that there was often a disconnect between the way that care is delivered or experienced and that reality versus sort of how everyone else imagined it should be. And so I really sort of took that idea of a frontline clinician as well as some experience in quality and safety, and have tried to bring that to the best of my ability to the work in innovation. When I think about the stakes, I think that there are two important points, and I'm speaking from a physician in the VA. We have seen, particularly as a result of the pandemic, the not only inequities in the system, but really have understood that in our case, the veteran really can be a consumer, but that we must empower them to be a consumer. And traditionally, we've looked at sort of the market, the healthcare market, as, well, it requires a prior authorization from the insurance company or the provider to write the prescription. And sort of irrespective of what the patient really may have wanted, there was all of these barriers that were put into place. And that sort of market has changed. I think it was changing and then really was accelerated. And for us in the VA, we have an aging population. We have veterans in certain regions of the country that we're seeing significant proliferation in terms of growth, and also other areas where we're seeing contraction. You look at the Northern Virginia area, a lot of veterans are retiring and moving there, starting jobs and families. And you can look at other parts of the country where we're seeing less and less and less. And equally, we also have a lot of veterans who receive their care in the community, meaning that they may go to their cardiologist in the community and then may go to the VA for their primary care. And so we have to then think about our role in this larger market as not only essential in coordinating care across multiple different systems, but in also recognizing that fragmentation has somewhat increased, and that we can't be everywhere and we can't be everything to everyone. But in order for us to truly ensure that we meet the mission of the VA to care for veterans, the role of digital being beyond the walls of the traditional hospital or health system, that it's going to be vital for us to get it right. Or we won't, at least, and I don't know that it's true hyperbole, but over the course of the next decade, we won't meet our mission in caring for the veteran.
And Sandeep, I'm wondering if you can talk about your perspective, from BARDA, sort of how does what the VA does impact what you do and vice versa? Are there any sort of best practices, things like that? What are the stakes for you?
Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm Sandeep Patel. I run the Division of Research and Innovation Ventures, or DRIVE, within BARDA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And one of the things that we do is invest in and partner with early stage companies, but lots of others to develop new capabilities in digital health. And one of the sort of perspectives that that I've come to appreciate in our work is that oftentimes what I see with digital health is that it's a solution looking for a problem, right? There's a lot of people talking about capabilities, whether it's artificial intelligence or some others. And they're sort of struggling and looking for the right use cases. And I think, one of the things that's powerful to me, at least, is to sort of reverse that trend, right? And start with, what are the very clear, urgent use cases that we need. I think COVID-19 has shown a lot of these examples all over the place. And the VA has that power, right? To show, what is it that the VA needs to empower its community. And point people in the right direction. And so that's one of the things that people come to us and that we thrive on, is like showing people where their use cases, and then there's magic in that development, I think.
Sure. Meena, I'd love to hear sort of from the Medicare side, what I guess Medicare has had this experience over the pandemic of sort of, innovating new payment models and things like this when it comes to digital health. And it seems like, Medicare, potentially the VA has a chance to sort of learn from what Medicare did, maybe vice versa. Maybe just tell us a little bit about what you do, and then sort of how you view, digital health at Medicare potentially being a roadmap for other agencies.
Sure. So Meena Seshamani and I lead Medicare. I'm the director for the Center for Medicare in Department of Health and Human Services. And absolutely, through the pandemic, there has been an explosion in innovation, both by necessity of the social distancing to make sure that people are still able to access care, so leveraging telehealth there. But also more broadly, the pandemic really required taking a more holistic approach to caring for our communities, because when you have an infectious disease, just caring for someone in the hospital and then declaring victory when they get discharged, you're going to lose the war, because they need to be able to isolate at home. You have to figure out how are they going to get food, what's going on with family members, and it really forced us to take that, broader approach in many ways. And so, it builds on some of the work that had already been going on, not only in Medicare, but, in the private sector as well, for private payers to think about care in a more holistic way, and to encourage some of these more holistic models where providers, come together as accountable care organizations, where they coordinate care and then are held accountable to meet quality metrics and to meet cost and savings parameters. And so, in some ways, the innovations that we've seen during the pandemic present an opportunity to kind of turn the crank and go to the next level of how we try to provide care outside of the, traditional, fee-for-service episodic aspects of care, and how do you incorporate new team members and new technologies to connect those team members and the beneficiary. So, just as in Medicare, we are learning from the innovations of the pandemic and how it dovetails with the innovations that were already ongoing. I think there's an opportunity to dovetail that with like what the VA is thinking about, and where there are opportunities to see where there are shared learnings, because I think everybody is figuring this out together, right? Like, I'll give another example. A huge priority of ours is advancing health equity, because definitely the pandemic showed how disparities and how cracks in the system really disproportionately impact certain populations. And equity is something that the veteran community faces as well, and disparities there. So how do various innovations, and particularly for this conversation, innovations in digital health, how do they support addressing equity? Or where are there ways in which disparities get exacerbated? When you think about access to technologies and cultural, issues, language access, et cetera. So I think there's lots of opportunities for shared learning.
And since you mentioned equity, I think that's such an important theme that I want to make sure we dig into here. Are there kind of specific things that agencies or entrepreneurs kind of in the private sector can do to ensure that their digital health things, maybe the stuff that they're pitching to people like Sandeep, how do you make sure that that it is equitable?
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts here. So I think one is, as companies, early and late, go to work with patients and caregivers and develop the evidence, I think they have to think about diversity, at that stage. And that's something that, we think about a lot in terms of, are you designing your device or your approach to, for multiple populations, for inclusivity, for, use cases in urban, rural areas, and, all of these things that, are sometimes hard to think about. And I think that's critical. One, and two is that, I think the promise of digital is that it is inclusive, right? And that, it actually opens up access, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think people, I think there are ways that we can intentionally design, whether it's using, multiple channels like, SMS or other kind of mechanisms to kind of ensure that diversity.
I would say that there are kind of two aspects to how digital health can impact equity. One is what Sandeep, articulated, that really thinking when you are developing things, thinking about that inclusivity, the accessibility, at that point. I think the other is that in addressing disparities, it really requires us to think upstream in terms of what impacts someone's health. And the further upstream you go, the more it exits that kind of traditional healthcare environment of a clinic or a hospital and starts to bring in, community aspects, transportation, housing, community-based organizations. And we don't have an electronic medical record for food insecurity, right? I mean, this is some of the things that I think the digital health space can really help to develop, to create that connectivity across the various sectors that have to come together if you are going to move further upstream in addressing someone's health more holistically.
Yeah, I think my colleagues nailed it. And one of the things that I think becomes fascinating about digital in and of itself is the promise of really personalized care. So when we look at technologies that I think of that are actually helping us transform this notion of personalized care, I can point to things like additive manufacturing, where I don't offer a small, medium, or large orthotic or prosthetic to the veteran. I custom manufacture one for them at the point of care. And while that still has some ways to go, I think what digital can and should do, and what should be at the forefront, absent the idea of, particularly for us, highly rural and lack of broadband and sort of separating the digital divide, can be that real prescriptive and personalized care that allows that individual to experience care in the way that they wish to experience it, and not always trying to have it in the traditional model of sort of the way that we have built it. And I think that when you move, Meena hit it perfectly, right? When you move further upstream, then you actually get to what impacts people's health, right? 40% is related to genetics or some degree of that. And then 30% is to social determinants or behavioral things that I, on the receiving end as a physician, by the time they're admitted to the hospital, right, I'm not really able to impact. And then I discharge them back into a community environment, which I haven't really thought carefully of, right? I say, okay, go eat healthy, but it's cheaper to go buy a 99-cent hamburger from McDonald's than it is to go to the grocery and get a head of lettuce. So I think that's it, right? That's where digital can come, is that this must be an ecosystem where everyone becomes a player. And that's, to me, that's going to be the most vital component of this.
I'd love to drill down into that a little bit more and sort of understand how we get there, right? And, especially when it comes to, social determinants, I know there's kind of this debate about, whose responsibility is it to offer those services and how do you link them up and things like this. Obviously, data is a huge issue also, tracking people's social needs. But I'd love to hear, and just kind of an open question for anybody, what can agencies do? What can people, entrepreneurs do to actually make those connections in a more meaningful way so that we can encourage uptake in government. I
can take a stab at this from one particular angle and invite Meena and Ryan to talk about from others. But I think one of the things that we're seeing, in terms of the pandemic, so I think about infectious disease a lot. That's a lot what we do at BARDA and what we're working on now. And, there's sort of these two traditional models, right, where there's healthcare delivery, right? And this is a relationship between patients and clinicians typically. And then there's sort of the public health model, right, which is more complicated. It's a relationship among all of us in these complicated ways. And clearly those two things are interlinked. But we don't treat them that way, and we treat product development separately, across the two. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to do is to come to terms with the fact that some things can cross boundaries in our public health goods, and that we have to design them that way. And I think digital health is the power of digital health is the scale and the ability to influence healthcare outcomes through a public health lens. And I think we got to just embrace that kind of model. But it complicates it because, then it's sort of, who the customer is, who you're designing for, what the pathway to development is becomes, all that much more muddled across the two.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'll loop back afterwards.
I always say this because I think this is sort of the power of where we're going, but this device knows far more about me and probably my the components that make up who I am and contribute to my healthcare than my electronic medical. And I think that we have to sort of move past this notion that, we're running predictive algorithms using AI or machine learning, using sort of these discrete episodic data points to try to predict acute kidney injury, which as a hospitalist, you're sort of trained to say, this person's on these medicines and they need these things, they may have a bad outcome, versus really trying to better develop applications with patients where they are, which is on their phone, in their home, things that they already have accessible. And the other thing is it's things within their workflow, right? It's we talk a lot about clinician workflow and adoption, and it's vital, but patient workflow, right? We can't build solutions that are going to be hard for them to use. They're not going to use them. So I think that's a real point of emphasis for innovators and entrepreneurs, is to be thinking about that human-centered design component of the solutions and matching that then to both the adoption on the clinician side or the patient side. Because then when you have something that's moving, right, really moving in a trajectory that's pushing the market, it becomes really hard to ignore versus the hundreds of things that are sort of just floating out there. And to Sandeep's point, right, waiting for a problem to solve.
Sure. Meena, did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, they captured it really. Like the way I view it as two opportunities. One, to really enable increased richness and more holistic aspects to the data that we can collect, so that we can identify where there are gaps, and then also track if any interventions are having impact, so that to Ryan's point, it's not just about those episodic pieces, but how are you going to address the health of a person if the only data you have is when they come in these episodes, right? By its very nature, that's a contradiction. And then the flip side of being able to have these technologies be very user-centered, where you're thinking about the workflows of the provider, what makes ease of use for the patients, but also how you connect across all of the various people who would be involved. So where you have the social services and the community-based organizations being able to communicate in an easy way back and forth with a provider, with a patient as well. So being able to connect in that way, which the traditional EMR doesn't, there have been definitely many efforts to have like closed loop referrals within the EMR and things like that, to connect social services and healthcare services, but there are huge opportunities there still for development.
And I see an interesting question in the chat. Someone had asked, what infrastructure do we need to make all this real? And that is often one of the questions. It sort of sounds great in theory, but how far away are we from being able to do this? What does it require sort of on the back end?
Yeah, I'll float this, and hopefully it's an answer and maybe more of a question. I mean, some of this is a grapple societally with how comfortable with all this data being shared, right? I mean, it's the notion of I was having this conversation with somebody last week about 23andMe, where people have yet to sort of come to full grips with. They're taking that information and they're using it now to help with pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenetics, and sort of, that's the joke of, are they paying you for that? But if it helps us get better treatments, are we willing for that data to be shared? And this is something I think that it's not necessarily that the technology is not there. I think we've got some ways to go, right? More people need to adopt standards. You know, I tell this joke. It's my wife says, look, sometimes we're interoperable, but today we're just not compatible. In the idea of like, it's right. Yes, interoperability is what we need, but we also need compatibility in the market. I mean, things have to be synergistic and complementary, right? I have to have the ability to work with USDA and integrate behavioral data and EMR data and understand how to then personalize somebody's discharge, recognizing that they're going into a food desert that doesn't have many opportunities for access to food banks. And how do I then enroll them in things like Meals on Wheels? That's a lot of people that need to play complementary roles. I mean, Meena sort of nailed this. And in order to do that, everyone's got to be bought in that this is the direction we're going in and this is the right thing. And it can't be a conversation of whose role is it. It has to be, it is all of our responsibility to make sure that we move care much further upstream so that on the downstream side, you know, we don't have sort of some of the outcomes we've witnessed over the past 18 months.
And do you see that taking shape as sort of a public-private partnership, or what exactly does that look like sort of structurally?
My personal opinion is I think it has to. I think, look, government has a role. We do have a role. But I shouldn't replace BARDA or Drive. I need to rely on them to do the work that they're doing. And then VA has a role. And same thing with CMS. So I think that there are interagency partnerships that must occur across the federal government, but we also have to rely on the private sector. I do not think anyone's going to solve this alone. I think it's an ecosystem and a delicate one because there's competing priorities. And when we can find those overlap from a common goal, I think it can be incredibly powerful.
I would like to point out one thing, and not to put the back on Ryan, but I think the VA in many ways is like the ideal place, right? The ideal, like, you know, I think a lot of times you see misses in the healthcare system because of fragmentation of, you know, payers, providers, and developers and other things like that. And I think, you know, the VA is just like, you know, the inventor of the multi-site clinical trial, right? This is like the ideal scenario where, you know, they serve a well-defined community. You know, they're everywhere in the US, and like, you know, I think it's a great place to think about it as a test bed for innovation.
I also wanted to hear from you, just, I know we only have a few minutes left, about where you see what areas of digital health you see as sort of ripest for disruption, to use a bunch of, you know, startup words, but you know, I'm thinking, where do we have the confluence of where the technology has reached a certain amount of, you know, minimum acceptance, where the regulations allowing for adoption, and what's been sort of proven out clinically right now. And I'm thinking like maybe behavioral health, talk therapy kinds of stuff. You know, what kinds of buckets of areas do you expect, you know, to be really transformative in the next, you know, year or two?
Yeah, so I'll make this comment, and then I think Meena I'm going to sort of push this to her and see if she'll take the bait. But digital therapeutics, I think, are an incredibly exciting market. I think they're going to, and we're seeing sort of tremendous amount of investment. We're seeing an FDA pathway in terms of approval and the need for better and more robust clinical efficacy and safety. But those, I think, are fascinating. Even on the VA side, the conversations we're having now is, what does this look like in terms of payment? So we know that there are companies that have launched some of the first value-based care payments models with digital therapeutics. I think it was Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Is it a pharmacy benefit? Is it part of a bundle? I mean, these are things I think that even we are talking about. And I know that at least I can only imagine CMMI and CMS are thinking about this as well. So that's one area that I think is really exciting with an enormous amount of potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think from and I think I'm next. You know, coming back to, you know, when we're talking about the pandemic, absolutely telehealth was it exploded, right? And so the question now is, where do we go from here? And Mohana, you mentioned, you know, behavioral health, right? That definitely is one area that I think it's been shown that telehealth works very well and is something that, you know, we have legislation that is now enabling that to move forward. Similarly, there has to be evaluations of other aspects of telehealth and what is beneficial to keep, and, you know, where do we go from there, and how can it be best utilized? And, coming back to Ryan's point about how we leverage it to further these value-based models where, if providers have the opportunity to innovate in how they are reaching patients, to do so to improve quality and to be more effective and efficient in how they're providing care, how can they leverage these technologies towards those ends? I think that will be an area for further investigation and evaluation moving forward.
Sandeep, did you have ideas?
Yeah, a couple of things to add to that, and things that we're investing in at BARDA. So one is, if I look at the bottlenecks, right, in the system and things where I think digital health could be impactful and are already starting to is, one is empowering patients further, right? And so whether it's, empowering people with knowledge about their own health state, current and future, infectious disease as an example, right? That prevents people from needing to go to the hospital, or some people from needing to go to the hospital in the first place. And that's incredibly powerful. And I think that's a ripe area. Another bottleneck, and this is a little bit of a different topic than we were talking about, but in developing new drugs and devices, the cost and time it takes to do that is incredibly high. And so I think there's a huge amount, whether it's smarter clinical trials, better sensors and things like that, the opportunity to actually lower the aggregate cost and time of developing clinical trials would just have a huge effect over the types of therapies that we that can come online. And then I have plenty more examples, but those are two big ones.
Sure. I kind of wanted to ask the flip side of the same question, which is, are there any areas that you think are sort of overhyped or that we're not quite ready for yet? And I'm sure, you all probably have different risk thresholds here when we think about, what we can adopt or pilot or invest in. But I'm just kind of curious if there's anything that's gotten a lot of attention maybe during the pandemic that's maybe not quite ready to take off in terms of everyday use. I think you might be muted if you, right?
It's got to happen one time a day. Look, and I say this with the caveat, I think we need to push forward, but the one area that I think has been overhyped is probably AI.
Are there any
at least in the clinical care delivery center? Yeah. Certainly an enormous amount of opportunity in the administrative area, but still a long way to go to get the right types of data to really make informed decisions on outcomes for patients, right? Once we get genomic data, the sky could be the limit, but I think we need to continue to build the infrastructure to utilize this well.
Sure. Meena, Sandeep, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would sort of agree with that. I would frame it a little bit differently in the sense that I think the power of digital health is when you stop talking about digital health. So if it's no longer a category unto itself, it's sort of penetrated the areas that are important. I think the fact that we do call out AI as like a separate thing just goes to show you that it is largely full of hype. And I think one of the challenges, just going back to the VA kind of piece of this too, is that we need better ways to generate evidence that things work and people use them in the way that they're intended to design, actually add value. And I think that's going to separate the hype from reality, ultimately.
I would say the key thing to think about is that healthcare is complex, and so there probably isn't one silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems. And so, kind of building on the themes of what I'm hearing from my co-panelists, right? It's about what is appropriate for what setting, with what type of data being put in, with what outputs you get, and who's involved, right? Like all of those factors will determine how effective a technology is ultimately. It's not that you can like pop a technology and then boom, everything is wonderful, right? So kind of remembering that the technology is part of an ecosystem, and how does it both influence that ecosystem, and how does that ecosystem leverage the technology to the best that it can be leveraged?
Sure. And so I know we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask one final question. I think I'm going to start with Meena and then go around and end with Ryan. If there was just one thing, maybe a piece of advice or one thing you would ask for from maybe the private sector, from digital health entrepreneurs, or maybe even from other government agencies in terms of how to better encourage digital health uptake, what would you say?
I would say think about that connecting the dots, and that connecting the dots occurs both in that in that data side, where you're enabling people to expand the aperture of the knowledge they have to be able to have impact, and connecting the dots and keeping in mind that usability aspect and that workflow aspect and what people value, either the patient or the person taking care of the patient.
Sure, Sandeep.
I was going to say something similar, which is just talk to a patient. I mean, just have a conversation, right? Get away from all the other fluff and just call, find a friend or whoever that you ultimately think this is going to be useful for, and just get their thoughts.
Ryan, you have the last word on this.
It's always hard going last because everybody, there's a couple of things. Solutions got to be practical. It's got to be meaningful. And I think I've seen two things kill any great idea or innovation. That's when you don't have alignment of incentives and something just isn't easy to use. And keep it simple.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. I will turn it back over to Jennifer.
Fantastic. Colleagues, Meena, Ryan, Sandeep, Mohana, what a tremendous way to end the day. I think an important reminder, despite the topics of our discussion today, that sort of, digital technology is not a silver bullet. And in fact, when we think about this powerful new set of tools in the toolbox, there was a great part of this discussion around who's responsible. And I love the answer that you all proposed, which is it's all of us. No one is coming. If we want to reimagine healthcare, if we want to really think differently about sort of healthcare being sort of how good we are at keeping people healthy, keeping them out of the clinic wherever possible, as opposed to how good are we at sort of swooping in once they're sick, that's really going to require that all of us come together and sort of really commit to thoughtfully, intentionally developing all of these tools together and in partnership with the patients, the veterans, and the care partners that we're all here to serve.